slaves toiled or soldiers marched. What better place to experience Lincoln's humble beginnings than to do so while serving that he knew growing up? Where better to learn about the challenges of becoming president in the parlor of his home, where he was told that he was the Republican's choice for that office? Where better to talk about the inspiration for the Gettysburg Address than at that place where some 3,000 soldiers died? And where better to tell the tragic story of the Lincoln assassination than next to the theater box where it occurred? The Lincoln story, the Civil War story, the Emancipation story are individually compelling, but taken together they tell this powerful tale of national tragedy with stories of individual and national resolve. But the national struggle for freedom continued beyond the end of the Civil War, beyond the passage in 1865 of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, beyond the passage in 1868 of the 14th Amendment, which ensured citizenship to African Americans, and beyond the passage in 1870 of the 15th Amendment, which ensured the right to vote was not denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The story extends to Cedar Hill, the Washington, D.C. home of Frederick Douglass from 1877 to his death in 1895. It extends to Alabama's Tuskegee Institute, where education provided hope and opportunity for former slaves and their children. The Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, where 9 African-American teenagers braved hostility in 1957 so they could attend school. To Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail in Alabama, where in 1965, bloody showed the depths of people's resolve to exercise their right to vote. And to Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site in Georgia, where, as a 15-year-old Booker T. Washington student, King gave a prize-winning speech titled The Negro Constitution, where he wrote, "After tumult and war, the nation in 1865 took a new stand, freedom for all people. Today, 13 million black sons and daughters of our forefathers continue to fight for the translation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments from writing on the printed page to actuality. We believe with them that if freedom is good for any, it is good for all." This young student ended his speech with, "The spirit of Lincoln still lives." Years later, in 1961, King, now a civil rights leader, wrote to another president, John F. Kennedy Jr., and he said, "The struggle for freedom, Mr. President, of which the Civil War was but a bloody chapter, continues throughout our land today. The courage and heroism of Negro citizens at Montgomery, Little Rock, New Orleans, Prince Edward County, and Jackson, Mississippi, is only a further effort to affirm that courage so painfully won in part upon the grassy battlefield of Antietam, Lookout Mountain, and Gettysburg." King's most famous look back at Lincoln and the Civil War came on August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to an audience of approximately 200,000. And King said, 5 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slaveholders will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. One day, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. We've been jumping ahead. Now we're going to jump back to the last slide to 100 years earlier, on December 3rd, 1861, in his first message to Congress. And Lincoln seemed to understand the gravity of the nation's situation then and what hung in the balance when he said, "The struggle of today is not altogether for today, but it is for a vast future also." Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, given all that you've said, it's hard for me to understand why, like black people today, some authors seem to be critical of Lincoln. Like he's the guy that basically solved the problem, but they're still critical of Lincoln, like Jerome Bennett's book.
Yeah. Jerome Bennett, And the view of Lincoln, it kind of ebbs and flows and cycles. When Bennett his book came out, Forced into Glory, maybe 10 years ago or something like that, where Bennett really discounts any of Lincoln's involvement and feels that Lincoln was a racist and didn't want to free the slaves, as his title implies, forced into glory. Bennett's book is not good history. A lot of what he writes and quotes is taken out of context. Certainly, some of the things Lincoln said is a little hard for our ears today to hear, his racial comments and things like that. But what's happened now? You know, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, it was Lincoln the great emancipator, and really Lincoln did it all on his own. To swinging, the pendulum swung the other way from Bennett's, where Lincoln really didn't want to do it at all. It was all African Americans through escape from slavery, folks like Frederick Douglass and white abolitionists who really affected the change. The reality of it is you might guess, is somewhere in the middle. Part on all these things, all these circumstances that came together. And there are still people that feel that Bennett is more accurate in his interpretation, and there are some that feel that Lincoln did it all too. So, you know, somewhere in the middle.
What would you think the percentage of black people would be that support Lincoln today?
Today, I don't know. Well, we're going to just do a quick projector change, and then we're going to show, it's a 26-minute film, it's a new film we show on the leadership. And that'll give you a better sense of what was going on in Springfield at the time, and then if there's questions after that, we can talk more.
We know him as the face on Mount Rushmore, through the words of the Gettysburg Address, the famous bearded statue of the Lincoln Memorial, the great emancipator, the 16th President of the United States. But before Abraham Lincoln was an icon, he was a man. And before he was a president, he was a husband, a father, a young lawyer struggling to make ends meet. Here, a born frontiersman transformed himself into a statesman. Under his folksy veneer, a man of intelligence, ambition, and deep concern about equality. He had arrived in Springfield alone, with no money, not even a place to stay. Here he would find all the pieces of his life. A wife, 4 children, a profession as a lawyer. Here, a young man would become Abraham Lincoln. And when he left Springfield 24 years later, he was headed for the White House and the pages of history. The year was 1837, and a young Abraham Lincoln was riding towards his future. Lincoln had already tried many of the jobs the frontier could offer: carpenter, postmaster, soldier, and surveyor. Now he was hoping for a new start in Springfield, with a law license and unbound ambition. Like Lincoln, Springfield in the 1830s was just getting started. It was a town on the edge of the prairie, with a few brick buildings, no paved roads, and hogs roaming the streets. It was a cross-section of the country: 1,500 Northerners and Southerners, whites and blacks, and immigrants. Thanks in part to Lincoln's work in the Illinois legislature, Springfield had been voted the new capital of Illinois. Lincoln had helped to transform Springfield, and Springfield would in turn change him. On April the 15th, 1837, Lincoln rode into town with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags. His first stop was a general store run by Joshua Speed.
Hello. How much would furniture for a single bedstead cost? Mattress and sheets.
$17.
Speed later said, "I thought that I had never seen so gloomy a face. The tone of his voice was so melancholy I felt for him." He suggested a way Lincoln could avoid the debt. He offered to share his room above the store.
That sounds good enough to me. How do I get on?
Right that way.
It was the beginning of a lifelong friendship.
Well, Speed, I move.
The young Abraham Lincoln was off to a good beginning. John T. Stewart, one of the most successful lawyers in town, had offered him a job as a junior partner. Stewart hoped to win a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, so Lincoln took over most of the legal business. It was a crash course in litigation. But Lincoln also loved politics. He was serving his second term in the state legislature as a representative of the Whig Party, making a name for himself as a forceful speaker. His low-key, easy-going, common-sense style appealed to many, and he soon found himself at the center of a growing group of friends. In the evenings, they would gather together to swap stories and talk politics at Speed's store. But something was missing. Mary Todd was the daughter of a well-known Kentucky political family. She had come to Springfield to live with her sister Elizabeth. When Lincoln met Mary, he was captivated by her looks, her ambition, her sassy intelligence, and her understanding of raw political power. The year was 1839, and Abraham Lincoln was dumbstruck. Mary's sister said,
Lincoln would gaze on her as if irresistibly drawn by some superior power. He never scarcely said a word.
Elizabeth thought they were a terrible match. But Mary saw a spark there that her sister did not.
So I'll be here now. Hello. Looking forward to getting out of the house for a little while.
And soon she and Lincoln were going out together, talking about marriage, until the day engagement fell apart. Some said it was due to Elizabeth's disapproval. Some said Lincoln feared that without any savings, he would not be able to support his new wife the way her family had. Whatever the case, Lincoln fell into a depression. He remained in bed for days, cared for by his friend Speed. Lincoln wrote, "I am now the most miserable man living." But by the next year, Lincoln and Mary had started courting again. And by the fall, he considered marriage again, even though he had a bad case of cold feet. He wrote Speed,
You have now been the husband of a lovely woman for nearly 8 months. Are you now in feeling as well as judgment glad you are married as you are?
And with this ring I may wed.
Speed must have had the right answer, because a month later, on November 4th, 1842, Abraham and Mary wed. Lincoln placed the ring on his wife's finger, They started out living in a rooming house called the Globe Tavern. But the city was expanding in all directions, and so was the Lincoln plan. With the birth of their first son, Robert, they decided to move. Lincoln purchased a small cottage in 1844 from the priest who married them. Recently built at the corner of 8th and Jackson, it was a simple 1.5-story home. The cost, $1,500.
Oh, this is wonderful.
Yes.
But to provide for it and his growing family, including a new son, Edward, born in 1846, he would have to work in earnest. Lincoln set himself to his career with a passion. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a circuit-riding attorney of the 8th Judicial Circuit. That meant that he traveled from town to town all through central Illinois, going from one case to the next. Lincoln would be gone for 3 months at a time, twice a year, leaving Mary alone for long periods to run the home and care for the boys. Meanwhile, Lincoln's career was taking off. He started his own law firm in Springfield. Juries liked Lincoln's down-the-home conversational style in the courtroom. He developed a gift for making words flow and a reputation for diligence and hard work. Lincoln's skills became evident as he appeared more and more before the Illinois Supreme Court. Leaders across the state began to notice this young lawyer. Combining politics with his legal business, Lincoln was starting to build alliances at courthouses across central Illinois. And it was just about to pay off. Lincoln's public speaking and the connections he had formed both at work and through his wife's family convinced him to run for a seat in the U.S. Congress. And when he won a solid victory and became a congressman, it was the biggest step of his young career. The young Lincoln was thrilled to head off to Washington. He brought his family with him. But they soon decided that Washington wasn't really a place for a young family. Abraham packed Mary and the boys back to stay with their parents in Kentucky and knuckled down to work. He voiced opposition to the Mexican War, but was soundly criticized for it. He proposed a bill to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and got nowhere. Missing his family, he wrote Mary and his sons heartfelt letters.
When you were here, I thought you hindered me in attending to business. But now, having nothing but business, it has grown exceedingly tasteless to me.
The strain of their separation was evident in Mary's letters as well.
How much I wish instead of writing we were together this evening. I feel very sad away from you. I must bid you good night.
Lincoln had pledged before the election that he would serve only one term. And so, in 1849, he found himself headed home, having had a lot less impact than he might have hoped. He seemed to lose interest in running for other office and buried himself in his work. And then a tragedy hit the family. In 1850, their 3-year-old Eddie Lincoln came down with tuberculosis. He was a rambunctious toddler they all loved, but the disease hit him hard. For 52 days, he struggled with sweat and tried to survive. On the 53rd day, he died.
His life here on earth is all too short.
The funeral service was held in the Lincoln home. Abraham and Mary were devastated. To fill the void in some small way, the Lincolns had another baby, their 3rd son, William. Another son, Tad, would follow soon after. As the family grew, work was pouring in. Lincoln became one of the most sought-after attorneys in the state, earning a very comfortable living for his family.
If convicted of thievery, he will be sent to the penitentiary. Gentlemen, what will happen to these children? I beg of you, for this man's family. I rest my case.
But it took the passage of a brand new bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 to pull him back into politics. All through these years, America had been slowly tearing itself apart over one of the most bitter issues of the time, slavery. To some, it was a sin. To others, it was a way of life. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was one of several stopgaps to avoid national conflict. It allowed slavery to continue in the South and the northern territories to stay free, until the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 changed everything. The new act said that any territories that joined the Union could vote on whether to become free or slave states, no matter their location. At the same time, a more restrictive fugitive slave law that had been passed several years earlier allowed slave catchers to capture and sell even free blacks into slavery. Suddenly, everything was up for grabs. Lincoln was outraged.
Mary, Douglas had managed to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed.
So Nebraska now has multiple slaves.
All the way to Canada. This repeals the Missouri Compromise. This is reckless. It's an outrage.
The law, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, allowed the people of the territories to decide the slavery issue themselves.
Their sovereignty, whether they wanted slavery in their new state or not. Can I count on your support?
Lincoln felt that since new territories could choose to be slave states, it could tip the entire country toward slavery. Lincoln began traveling to give speeches, talking out against the new act.
For although volume after volume was written to prove slavery a very good thing, we never hear of a man who wishes to take the movement by being a slave himself.
Soon Lincoln was running for office again. The year was 1850, and he set his sights on the U.S. Senate. Lincoln was a popular candidate, but back then the Senate was picked by the state legislature, not the voters.
They call for a vote. A vote for United States Senator.
Lincoln. 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 Lincoln.
And while he had enough votes to lead in the first round, he did not have enough votes to win a clear majority.
The only way to do this is to give who are most control.
Mary watched with disappointment as Lincoln withdrew his name and allowed another candidate to win for the greater good of opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But for him, it was just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, Lincoln crisscrossed the region, speaking out against slavery. In 1858, he stepped up to formally oppose the man behind the act he hated so much, Senator Stephen A. Douglas himself. This time, Lincoln was running as a member of the rapidly growing new Republican Party. He came to the Illinois State House to deliver a vote.
Until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided.
For the first time, Lincoln was stepping onto the national stage. And it was a series of debates with his longtime rival Douglas that would grab the nation's attention. 7 debates in 7 towns.
I hold that the Negro is not and ought never be a citizen of the United States. I hold that this government was made on the white basis, by white men, for white men, and their posterity forever.
The New York Evening Post declared, "The prairies are on fire."
I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this they meant.
Lincoln's Republican Party would beat Douglas's Democrats in the popular election by over 4,000 votes. But Lincoln would lose once again in the state legislature.
Order! Order! The votes have been counted. Mr.
not at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats. If the debates with Douglas put Lincoln down, it was a speech at New York's Cooper Institute that would mark his arrival as a national.
If our sense of duty forbids this, then let us stand by our duty fearlessly and effectively. Let us not be slaves from that. Let us have faith that might makes might, and in that let us dare to do our duty as we understand it.
It was a remarkable performance. He had taken a crowd skeptical of this frontier politician and turned them into cheering fans. Lincoln was not the first choice of many in the Republican Party, but thanks in part to the tireless efforts of many friends from Central Illinois working behind the scenes, he became the Republicans' nominee. A committee from the convention traveled to Springfield to read the formal notification of Lincoln's nomination in the parlor of his home.
This is a great honor and most humbling.
Almost immediately, the campaign began in earnest. Lincoln became known as the rail splitter, an honest, hard-working man from the West. One part of his image came from an unexpected source. In October of 1860, Lincoln received a letter from an 11-year-old girl named Grace Biddell. She promised to get the men in her family to vote for Lincoln if he'd let his beard grow.
Ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president.
When election day rolled around, Lincoln waited on edge for the returns. He didn't hear till after midnight.
This is wonderful, gentlemen. I know a little woman on 8th Street who would like to hear this. Thank you.
At 1:30 in the morning, Lincoln hurried home to tell his wife the news.
Mary, we are elected. We're going to Washington.
The celebrations began that night in Springfield. A native son had become the president. But there were not celebrations everywhere. With 4 candidates for president, Lincoln did not win the majority of the popular vote. And in some parts, as the votes were being counted, he was subjected to negative portrayals in many newspapers. Just 6 weeks after his election, the first state would secede from the Union. Even as Lincoln prepared his home to formulate his new administration, the nation was falling apart around it. Lincoln was under extreme pressure to compromise with the South, to give on the slave issue to save the Union. What should have been a period of celebration was a tense time, a time of uncertainty, as Lincoln held his ground. He wrote,
If we surrender, it is the end of us, end of the government.
The day before he left Springfield, Lincoln returned to his law office and told his partner Herndon, "Tell our clients that the election of a president makes no change in the firm of Lincoln and Herndon. When I come back, we'll go right on practicing law as if nothing had ever happened." The following morning, just before 8 a.m., a crowd of townspeople gathered at the Great Western Railroad station to see off their favorite son. In an emotional farewell, the president-elect paid tribute to the town which had shaped him, the one home his father had ever known.
My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here, I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here, my children have been born.
and one is spared. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with the task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I trust in your prayers you will commend me. I bid you an affectionate farewell.
Lincoln was leaving his home of nearly 25 years to lead a divided country. He could not have known how much it would demand from him. But Lincoln would draw upon lessons he learned in Springfield. 4 years of late Civil War would test his strength, determination, his ability to handle tragedy, and keep on going. Ultimately staying the course, to guide the nation toward a new birth of freedom.
Any questions about the film or presentation?
I mentioned this to you earlier. Can you talk a little bit about the whole process of redoing his house and the whole neighborhood that you kept so beautiful?
Yeah, the Lincoln Home National Historic Site is 4 city blocks, 12.2 acres of us, in downtown Springfield. And when it was established, authorized in 71 and established the following year, 1972, it was to, of course, continue to preserve and maintain the Lincoln Home itself, although the state of Illinois had been doing that since 1887 and doing, a fine job. But the goal was to get a surrounding neighborhood feel of, as well as a buffer zone around the Lincoln Home to kind of do as much of a restoration as we could. And I think the unique process, our master plan was finished in 1970, which would have been 2 years before the park was actually established. And a lot of the initial research was done by Ed Bars, came out and researched the history of not only the home, but did a house-by-house history of each property in what was very limited time to determine then for the Park Service which houses we were going to keep and which houses we were going to or more modern commercial structures we would tear down. And so after 1972, that took about 8 years to get the 4 blocks all acquired, and then work was begun in earnest in restoration. At least trying to get a sense of that Lincoln neighborhood for the houses that survived over time. Today we have empty lots. Lincoln would have seen houses on all the properties within the neighborhood. If you grab a brochure for the Lincoln Home area, there's an artist's rendition, kind of a bird's eye view of what we think that neighborhood looked like. So it was a process of restoration, rehabilitation to give a buffer zone around the Lincoln Home. So now we have 14 historic structures, 2 of which are museum exhibit space, not counting the Lincoln Home, but they're all modern inside, not counting the Lincoln Home. And so there's offices in some of them, some that we use, some that are leased out, and then the Lincoln Home itself. The state of Illinois did a major restoration in the mid-1950s, opening the 2nd floor for the first time. And then the Park Service did a restoration in 1987, reopened in June of 1988. So that's, and then we've been working continually on restoration of the houses in the neighborhood. We're almost done, we've got a couple left to go.
Any plans to rebuild those empty lots?
They're in our 1970 master plan called for reconstruction of 2 missing houses right at the intersection, right at the core of the park, to kind of try to give a little better context to an urban neighborhood. We're now going through finishing up a new general management plan that will be our guiding document for the next 20 years. It calls for a slight modification, still putting something in those 2 lots, maybe not quite a reconstruction, but filling in those blocks, and then there's another house too. So otherwise, probably just leave those lots empty, but try to do something to represent to visitors that there were houses on the lots.
With some of the homes in the neighborhood, 1860s, 1850s, 1840s homes?
Yeah, all of them that were maintained are from the 1860s in some form or another. Now, it might be that there's an 1860 or 1850s house inside, but what we ended up restoring, going through National Park Service policies and Secretary of Interior standards and all those kinds of policies we have to follow in restoration, we might have only taken the house back to maybe 1880s or something like that. Just the reason being, you only go back as far as you feel confident with the information you have. When you're doing more guessing, then you've gone too far. So that's kind of what we ended up with. So the time periods vary just a little bit. But there are some houses, the Lincoln home was built in 1839. We've got a couple late 1830s, early 1840s houses, and then they go on up. Actually, one of the houses is probably time period restored more than 1900, but I think we should take a shot at that one someday and try again.
If the house had aluminum siding, would that do that then remove?
Yes, although for the bicentennial, we put vinyl siding on one of the houses that we haven't restored yet, just to make it look good. Yeah, what happened, and quite honestly, if Lincoln Home were to be established today, there wouldn't be such measures taken, probably, because the philosophy behind preservation restoration has changed over time, so there wouldn't be this wholesale demolition that went on probably at that time. But the idea was, yes, to remove anything modern. But the truth of the matter is, you'll never get to an 1860 neighborhood. We'd have to have mud streets for one, and all those other elements that we're just not going to go that far with. But the interesting thing is, people just assumed it was the National Park Service that closed 8th and Jackson streets, but really the city of Springfield did that in the 1960s. There were all kinds of plans for the Lincoln Home neighborhood dating back to 1909. Interesting thing was, in 1909 there was a proposal to set aside 4 blocks around the Lincoln Home. It ended up being the same 4 blocks that we ended up with in 1972. But the idea then was just tear everything down and create a landscape park with classical buildings, reflecting pools and fountains and amphitheaters, and have the Lincoln Home sitting kind of by itself in a park-like setting. But as time went on, the attitudes towards preservation and restoration changed. Same holds true if you visited the Lincoln Home, let's say in the late 1800s, early 1900s. What you saw when you went in there and you only toured the first floor were just a bunch of artifacts and cases that could have related to the assassination, the presidency, the Springfield years. People, as you might guess at that time, didn't need to go to a historic house museum to learn about cooking fireplaces and outhouses. They were living cooking fireplaces and outhouses. They wanted to see the cool Lincoln stuff. So they were able to do that in the home. But then as time went on, then attitudes started to change. That, well, maybe we ought to reflect a residential home. And then attitudes started to change in the 1960s about preservation. Historic Preservation Act of 1966 is an indication of when those attitudes started to change as a reaction to what was going on with urban renewal, the interstate highway system. Many historic buildings and structures were lost. So that attitude was changed by the city of Springfield. They passed historic preservation zoning ordinances with things like aluminum siding and modern architecture were prohibited in that 4-block area. Portions of the streets. In fact, that preservation zoning ordinances was challenged all the way to the Illinois State Supreme Court and upheld. So that was a precedent-setting case for Illinois that cities and towns could impose such ordinances. And then the Park Service stepped in because the city and the state kind of knew the direction that it should go, just didn't have the resources to do it. So attitudes changed over time.
Jim, were you director when this was done? 89,
So just, yeah, the home had just reopened in '88.
We've had Ed here a couple of times. He has roots over at Williamsburg. I think he was back in Peru and those. We've had Ed here twice.
Please don't ask me the kinds of questions you ask Ed. You can ask a guy like Ed Mars and he'll just rattle off those answers. It's amazing.
I wonder whether it's always true.
Well, some of those questions, who would know, right? Who would know?
When we were there, I tried to look where the old Edwards mansion was. It's torn down, but I couldn't even find a marker.
No, there's no marker. It was near 2nd and Edward Streets, and that's where the current state capitol is in Springfield, and Lincoln owns on 8th Street, so it'd be about 6 blocks almost due west.
Don't you think it's worth to mark the site?
I don't think so. It was the interesting thing. It was torn down in the early 1900s. By the state of Illinois, they built one of the state buildings that's there. Yeah. And the other thing, if you've been to the park, Lincoln in my was a 2-story brick building. A few minutes ago, there all the buildings that survived were from the 1860s, except for that one, which is from the 1960s. It was built before the Park Service as a 3/4 scale version of that Edwards home where the Lincolns were married. There's a guy that built it. He recreated the parlor inside, and so you can pay an admission to go see the parlor where the Lincolns were married, go upstairs and see dioramas of Lincoln's life. And when I was working the frontline intern, and people would come and say, well, where's the house where the Lincolns were married? I remember visiting that in the 60s and trying to explain to them, well, it really wasn't. They look at you like, yes, it was. Well, then later I saw a picture of the outside of that building when it was a museum. And you really have to read the fine print on the sign. It's big letters, house where Lincolns were married, and then you have to read, replica underneath, so I could see where visitors would have been confused.